I have always hated cataloging nursery songs. What point is there in archiving the soothing nonsense one species hums to its offspring? Every culture has lullabies, simple melodies, predictable rhythms, nothing worth a dedicated study. I was assigned the humans only because their music was so pervasive across all their fractured nations. Same tune, same contour, same interval drops. Archival drudgery. Then, on a whim, I plotted the waveform as a frequency shift graph against known pulsar timings, and my respiration stopped. It wasn't a lullaby at all. It was a beacon, a pristine celestial route map pointing straight back to Earth. This is the story of a discovery that shattered every assumption about humanity's place in the cosmos. The lullaby is a map, meaning human infants have been programmed with stellar coordinates for thousands of years. But who wrote the first verse? And what happens when the signal is finally answered? The clues begin not in a laboratory, but in a child's nursery, buried in the ancient clay tablet of a mother's song. Dr. Sira Voss was the last person the coalition wanted on cultural archivists. She specialized in cryptographic linguistics, decoding ancient dead languages, not humming nursery rhymes to herself in a sterile lab. But a budget shortfall and a bureaucratic error dumped the entire human music archive on her desk. She was ordered to catalog it, nothing more. So she started with the lullabies because every species has them and they're always the same predictable waste. Within 3 days, she was packing her office at 3 in the morning because nothing about these was predictable. 37,000 distinct human cultures, spanning isolated island chains and mountain valleys that hadn't seen an outsider for 8,000 years. And yet, the same lullaby. Not similar, identical. Same melody contour, same descending intervals, same 6/8 time. That's not possible. Cultural diffusion on a planetary scale requires contact, and these groups hadn't even known the others existed. She pulled the archaeological records. A 4,000-year-old Sumerian tablet from Mesopotamia bore the same tune, carved in cuneiform notation. The lullaby predates writing, predates agriculture. So how did it survive, unchanged, across every ocean and every epoch? But here's the thing about Sira Voss. Before linguistics, she trained in exonavigation. She knew that deep space pilots used pulsar frequencies as a universal coordinate system, a map that works from anywhere in the galaxy. And a melody is just a sequence of frequencies. She converted the notes into hertz, aligned them to standard pulsar timing arrays, and plotted the result in 3 dimensions. The points formed a perfect vector, a flawless navigation route. And the origin point was a single, unremarkable yellow star. Sol, Earth. Her hands were shaking as she ran the second verse. In some cultures, the lullaby had extra measures, words that varied, so linguists dismissed them as regional flourishes. But when she mapped those variant frequencies independently and combined them, they didn't point to Earth. They pointed away. Into a dark patch of space on the galactic outskirts, a region surveyed and marked as empty. Except when Sira overlaid the Deep Field Radio Survey from 70 years ago, she found a spike. A faint, rhythmic pulse, hidden in the noise, transmitting continuously, for over 3,000 years. The lullaby wasn't just teaching human children how to find home. Someone was singing it back. Sira Voss stood before the Coalition Sub-Council on Xenocultural Affairs 4 hours later, still trembling, clutching a data slate that contained the most dangerous discovery in galactic history. The council chamber was a half-ring of tiered seats occupied by delegates from 17 species who had long considered humanity a curiosity, a tough, resilient newcomer, but ultimately nothing more than another loud mammal from a gravity-heavy rock. She had exactly 10 minutes to destroy that assumption forever. She played the lullaby first. The melody floated through the chamber's ambient translators, a gentle descending hum that any human infant would recognize. A few delegates shifted in their seats, expecting a dry academic lecture. Then she overlaid the frequency plot. The waveform flattened into a grid of pulsar timings, and then she animated the trajectory, a golden line shooting from the blank of deep space straight into the heart of the Sol system. Someone dropped a drinking vessel. The delegate from the Kale Collective, a species that had never known war, made a sound like a malfunctioning ventilator. Sira didn't stop. She displayed the Sumerian tablet, carbon dated to 2,000 years before the Common Era, its cuneiform tune matching the melody note for note. Then a bone flute from a Neolithic cave in what humans called Germany, 40,000 years old, its 5 finger holes pitched in identical intervals. Then an oral recording from an isolated tribe in the Amazon, contacted for the first time only 3 decades ago, and when the translator asked the grandmother to sing the Song of Sleep, she sang the same lullaby in the same key with the same falling cadence. The evidence was undeniable. The song was not a cultural artifact. It was an installed program, buried in the human genome, passed down through 1,000,000 mothers across 40 millennia, and all of it pointing home. The human delegate, a woman named HFY who had been appointed to the council only 6 months prior, stood up without permission. Her face was pale. She asked Sira to replay the second verse map, the one that pointed outward into the dark. When the holographic vector materialized, leading from Earth to a nondescript patch of interstellar void in the Orion Spur, HFY whispered something in her native Igbo that the translators rendered simply as, "My grandmother called it the song of the ancestors who watch from beyond the sky." That was the pivot. Until that moment, the council had assumed the lullaby was a human beacon, a way for lost children to find their way back to the homeworld. But the transmission Sira had detected wasn't a human signal. It was coming from outside. Something out there had been broadcasting for 3,000 years on a frequency embedded in a lullaby that predated human civilization. And the only way anyone could have known the return frequency was if they planted the song in the first place. The chamber descended into controlled chaos. The military attaché from the VAR Empire, a massive-scaled being who had once famously declared all induction ceremonies a waste, rose to his full height and demanded a military quarantine of the Sol system immediately. The pacifist blocs argued for careful study. The human delegation, now 3 people who had been pulled from a diplomatic reception, sat in stunned silence, realizing that their entire species might be the children of something far older and far less benevolent than they had ever imagined. Sira, however, was still running the numbers. She had fed the return signal into her analysis suite before the meeting, and now, as the delegates argued, she saw the final piece click into place. The signal was not a steady beacon. Its amplitude and phase shift pattern had changed over the centuries, and when she overlaid those shifts against a timeline of human technological milestones, the correlation was absolute. The first radio transmission in 1901 caused a flicker. The Trinity nuclear test in 1945 caused a spike. The Apollo 11 moon landing in 1969 triggered a full harmonic response. And the moment humanity achieved faster-than-light travel and joined the coalition, exactly 17 months ago, the signal switched from a beacon to a countdown, a silent clock ticking backward. And as she was about to announce this, her slate flickered with a real-time alert from the Deep Space Monitoring Array. The signal from the void had stopped. The silence that replaced it was not empty. It was the kind of silence that precedes the snap of a trap. Something had received the final handshake. Something had begun to move, and it was heading straight for Earth. The thing about an interstellar countdown, Sira learned in the next 48 hours, is that it doesn't stop just because you noticed it. The deep space arrays tracked the silence for 3 hours before it resolved into something far worse, a gravitational lensing cascade. Something massive, far larger than any ship in the Coalition registry, was accelerating from the void. Its drive signature didn't match any known propulsion system. It bent spacetime around itself like a fist-crumpling paper, and it was gaining speed. The Coalition Security Council convened an emergency session, and for the first time in 300 years, the VAR delegates' demand for quarantine was not dismissed as warmongering. Even the pacifist species voted to authorize defensive mobilization. But the mathematics didn't care about votes. At the entity's acceleration curve, it would arrive inside the Sol heliopause in less than 60 days. That meant whatever decisions the council made, they had to be right the first time. There would be no second contact committee. Sierra didn't attend the military briefings. She was locked in her lab with a team of xenolinguists, signal analysts, and one terrified human cultural anthropologist who kept repeating that lullabies were supposed to be soothing. That's the whole point. They were combing through every scrap of the return signal, decompressing its phase shift modulations layer by layer. What they found made the military threat look almost manageable. The signal wasn't just a beacon reply. It was a carrier wave. Nested inside the main frequency, hidden below the noise floor of even coalition sensors, was a dense packet of data written in a syntax that matched nothing ever recorded, except for one fragment. Sierra recognized it from her doctoral thesis. It was a root grammar, the linguistic ancestor of 17 dead languages found on 17 separate worlds, worlds that had never known each other. All of them had lullabies too. All of them had been singing the same song. The implication hit her like a physical blow. Earth wasn't the only nursery. Humanity wasn't the only crop. The same entity that had planted the lullaby in a Sumerian mother's throat had seeded the entire galactic arm with the same melody, the same coordinates, the same slow-maturing trap. And now every single one of those civilizations was about to receive the same recall signal. The countdowns were synchronized. Delegate Akafer arrived at the lab unannounced, brushing past the coalition guards with the kind of authority that comes from realizing your entire species might have been bred as livestock. She placed a small object on Sierra's console, a wooden rattle, carved from West African ebony, passed down through her family for 9 generations. She asked Sierra to scan its internal resonance. Sierra hesitated, then ran the acoustic analysis. The rattle's pellet chamber was tuned to a specific frequency, the exact frequency of the return signal's lowest harmonic. It had been carved with deliberate acoustic engineering 200 years before radio was invented. But here's the thing that made Sierra's blood freeze all over again. When she cross-referenced the rattle's resonant frequency with the complete data packet, the translation engine she'd been building suddenly snapped into alignment. The packet wasn't a message. It was an activation key. The lullaby wasn't a map. It was a programming language. And the return signal had just sent the execute command. Across all human space, within the hour, coalition medical monitors began reporting an unexplained neurological phenomenon. Human infants everywhere, every baby still young enough to be sung to sleep, stopped crying simultaneously. Their brainwave patterns shifted into a synchronized delta rhythm never before observed, and every single one of them in perfect unison began humming the lullaby back, not the version their mothers sang, the return version, the one from the void. The older children, the ones who'd grown past the lullaby age, didn't hum, but they remembered. When questioned, they described a dream they'd all shared that night, a dark field of stars, a warm voice calling them home, and an overwhelming sense that they had been away from somewhere for far too long. Sierra listened to the recordings and realized the voice was speaking a word that translated across every human language family with perfect clarity. It meant children, and it was calling them to wake up. Something out there had just taken a census of its scattered harvest. And in 60 days it would arrive to collect. The 60 days did not crawl. They vanished. Coalition fleets from 40 species assembled in the Sol system in a bristling defensive sphere. The human homeworld, so recently a newcomer to galactic politics, was now its unwilling hinge. Parents held their humming infants and waited. There were no negotiations because the signal that had transmitted for 3 millennia never responded to hails. It just kept getting closer. And then, on the 58th day, Sira Voss finally decoded the nested syntax of the carrier wave and understood that every assumption the galaxy had made was catastrophically wrong. The data packet was not an activation key for a weapon. It was a certificate of inheritance. The grammar that underlay 17 dead languages was a legal document. The lullaby was the galactic equivalent of a title deed. Tens of thousands of years ago, a species that called itself the first singers had seeded the Orion Spur with life, not as a farm, but as a nursery for sapience. They encoded their home address in a song so that any child species that grew old enough to interpret the melody would know where to find their legacy. The return signal was not a recall. It was an automated probate notification. The universe had just been waiting for someone to prove they could read the fine print. But Sira had uncovered something darker beneath the legacy clause. The first singers had not vanished voluntarily. They had been silenced by something else, a predatory intelligence that fed on emergent consciousness, and the lullaby was also a booby trap. Any civilization capable of converting a lullaby into a pulsar map had reached a threshold where they would attract that predator. The countdown was not a welcome signal. It was a final test. If the inheritors could survive the predator's attention for 61 days, the legacy unlocked. If they failed, the nursery was culled before the predator could spread. 3 other seeded worlds had decoded the lullaby before humanity. All 3 had gone silent within that window. The singing from the void was not the predator. It was the last echo of the first singers, a recorded loop left behind to arm the survivors, and the infants humming in unison were not a census. They were a distributed immune response. Humanity's youngest nervous systems were acting as antennae, broadcasting a jamming frequency that Sira herself had accidentally activated by playing the return signal. On day 60, the predator arrived not as a ship but as a thought, a psychic pressure that pressed against every sentient mind in the system like a migraine made of static. The defensive fleets went dark. Pilots gripped their consoles, convulsing. And then the infants inhaled, all of them, across all human space at the exact same instant and exhaled a single note. A note that was not a frequency. It was an anti-frequency, a vacuum of meaning that swallowed the predator's signal whole. The pressure vanished. The fleets rebooted. The sky cleared. And Sira realized, looking at the decoded will of a billion-year-dead species, that the lullaby was never a map to Earth. Earth was just one stave in a much older score. The map had always pointed outward into the dark, to a place where the first singers had built something they called the library. And now, for the first time, the door was open. Humanity had inherited not a home, but a song written on the fabric of space-time, and the first verse was just ending. I never wanted this assignment. A contemptible errand to catalog primitive nursery songs, a punishment for some forgotten bureaucratic slight. And yet here I stand, holding the translated will of a billion-year-old species, written in the melody a human mother sings to her child. We are orphans no longer. We are inheritors of a library we never built, born from a song we did not write but have always carried. The predator that silenced the first singers is gone, blotted out by the breath of infants who cannot yet speak. That is the final genius of the design. The lullaby was never just a map to Earth. It was an immune system for the mind, dormant until activated by the very threat it was meant to defeat. The library is real. It waits in the dark, stocked with the cumulative knowledge of a billion years of sapience. And now humanity has the key. The song's first verse guided us home. Its second verse, I suspect, will lead us to somewhere far stranger. If you want to see what happens when humanity unlocks that door, subscribe. Because this story does not end here. It has only just learned to sing.